I remember being a kid growing up, sitting at the dinner table with my family. Whenever I had just one or two bites of food left on my plate, my parents would always tell me, "You better eat those last few bites. There are a million people in Africa that would do anything for that food." When I was a kid, this would spark my guilty conscience and help me power through eating those last few bites. But as I grew older, that simple statement began to ignite a much larger discussion in my mind. I began to ask myself, why is food so readily available and cheap for here for us, but in places like Africa, people die every single day because they can't get the food and water they need? To answer this question, I first began looking at our own food production system. Every day, millions of people grab food from the shelves at grocery stores for their families. But do we really know where that food comes from? According to the Center for Urban Education about Sustainable Agriculture, the average meal in the US travels about 1,500 miles before reaching your plate. 1,500 miles. This shocked me. That means if you live here in San Diego, your food traveled over halfway across the country, more specifically just 31 miles outside of Minneapolis, Indiana, to get your plate. Also, I don't know about you, but when I thought about where my fruits, vegetables, and meats came from, I imagined nice farms with corn rows and vegetable rows, livestock on the pasture, and a big wooden farm painted red. The stereotypical American farm. While this dream may have been true in the past, the reality of our food production system is very different and deserves some attention. The, the image of the stereotypical American farm didn't just fall out of the sky. This used to be what the large majorities of the farms in the United States looked like, in one way or the other. However, with pressures of making higher profits and continuing to provide the growing population with sufficient amount of food, large farms began incorporating industrial and scientific practices into agriculture. This is when traditional farming began to be replaced by industrial farming. Arguably, the most significant leap in agriculture in the last century occurred via the hands of Herbert Boyer and Stanley Cohen. In the early 1970s, the two biochemists discovered a method that allowed them to genetically alter an organism to give it specific traits. They did this by detaching the parts of one organism's DNA and reattaching it to the DNA of another organism, and thus the genetically modified organism was born. GMOs allow farmers to grow plants that grow closer to each other, stay fresh longer, are more resistant to pesticides and herbicides, and have many more benefits. The popularity of these super seeds grew so rapidly that now a large majority of seeds in the United States are actually genetically modified. It seems like these GMO plants and seeds are better for everybody, right? Farmers can produce more product and lose less to pests. Consumers enjoy the benefit of reduced prices and thanks to increased farm efficiency. What could possibly be wrong with this situation? People weren't thinking about the long-term effects. As the years went by, critics began to look into the negative effects of GMOs on the health of people and our environment. While there is currently no evidence to show that there are long-term health effects of GMO consumption, many researchers believe that this is because they haven't been around long enough to study. However, there is evidence of short-term health effects. This can be seen with the chemical levels in some food products. Glyphosate is the primary ingredient in Roundup, a herbicide made by Monsanto, which is sprayed on herbicide-resistant GMOs plants to ensure that no weeds will hinder their growth. This basically happens with all GMO plants. However, it has been proven that plants take up chemicals during the production process. What was Monsanto's response? They said, no data has ever indicated residue levels on food of more than a fraction of the EPA's very conservative allowable daily intake or any level of concern. The question still remains that this has long-term effects on humans. Monsanto has been the center of attention for many lawsuits regarding the health effects of their products over the past decade, but it wasn't until very recently that they lost their first lawsuit. The company had to surrender $289 million to Dwayne Johnson, who was diagnosed with cancer due to exposure to Roundup over his career as a custodian. Will this decision turn the tides and encourage people to take a look into the effects of chemicals that they put on our food? Only time will tell. The effects of GMOs can also be seen in the health of our environment. As I mentioned before, the average meal travels about 1,500 miles from the farm to your plate. Think about all the fossil fuel being wasted to take your food across the country to your grocery store, when the same fruit or vegetable could have been purchased from a local farmer. All these transportation costs take a toll when you think about grocery stores all over the country restocking fresh food every single day. Another effect on the environment is the decline of biodiversity in the area. Biodiversity is the variety of different species and organisms that live in the ecosystem. Basically, it's if an ecosystem has a lot of different kinds of species in it. Biodiversity promotes ecosystem productivity. An ecosystem is productive if it is able to produce oxygen in nutrient-rich soil, which is essential to harvesting plants. Because GMO plants have desired traits that make them stronger and more resistant than the rest, they will slowly outcompete the native plants for space in the surrounding area, decreasing the ecosystem's biodiversity. This is a problem that most people don't think about when introducing GMO plants into their area. As I continue to think more about farming and food production, I remember that agriculture isn't limited to production of plants, fruits, and vegetables. It also includes raising and harvesting livestock for people to eat. Industrial agriculture has its own take on this process, and it's called a concentrated animal feeding operation, or CAFO for short. The image of the stereotypical American farm that I described earlier was destroyed the very first time I visited one of these CAFOs. When I was growing up, my father owned a meat processing facility in the Bay Area, so I was always around these discussions and conversations about how to properly raise animals for good meat. One day, when I was probably about 14 years old, my dad decided to take me to a CAFO as a father-son field trip. After driving about 5 hours down I-5, I began nagging my dad and asking him if we were there yet. He replied to me, "You'll know when we're almost there. Trust me." Sure enough, 10 minutes later, a strong smell hit my nose. A terrible smell. Pardon my language, but it smelled like hundreds of tons of crap. Upon arrival, as far as I could see was dirt lots, crowded with cows numbering in the thousands, standing ankle deep in their own feces. No open lots for them to graze and eat grass were in sight. Rather, the animals spend their lives stuck in small, crowded, and unhealthy living quarters and fed genetically modified corn and other grains. These are attempts by the company to save money through cutting down property costs by confining the cows in small spaces and feeding them genetically modified corn to make them grow faster. Many animals fostered this way grow so fast that their bones can't keep up with the rapid growth of their body, allowing them only to have the strength to take a couple steps before falling down and having to lay to rest. The unsanitary conditions at these CAFOs present major health risks not only for the animals, but also for the food we eat. These poor conditions are breeding grounds for disease, and many animals contract them and even die before reaching the slaughterhouse. To combat this, rather than creating a healthier environment for the animals, companies feed them antibiotics to try and keep them healthy. If even one of these animals contracts a dangerous disease, it can be easily spread from one animal to another and into our food supply. Let's not forget about the effects of these factory farms on our environment. Think about it. Having thousands upon thousands of animals in these lots, you can imagine the enormous amount of waste they create on a daily basis. What to do with all this waste has baffled those that use these processes for years, but their current solution is a large man-made pools called manure lagoons. The problem with manure lagoons is that they are known to leak into the surrounding environment. Either due to subpar construction of the lagoon or due to periods of high rainfall, these lagoons may leak or overflow into neighboring fields. This may lead to soil becoming overloaded with nutrients or contaminated with disease, making it much less productive. Factory farms like this also release massive amounts of ammonia, hydrogen sulfide, methane, and particulate matter into the atmosphere, all of which have negative health consequences for us and the environment. In fact, agriculture now ranks as one of the single leading causes of pollution in the United States. Farming this way is not sustainable for our health or the health of our planet. These conditions our food is exposed to before it reaches our tables puts all of our healths at risk through exposure to toxic chemicals and unsanitary conditions. The processes used to grow and harvest this food is extremely detrimental to our environment. Air pollution, loss of biodiversity, disease, the list of consequences goes on and on. You may be asking yourself, what is the right way to produce food nowadays then? Again, I'll bring up the image of the stereotypical American farm. It should look something like that. We would see a wide variety of crops being grown on different plots and animals grazing in the fields with free space to run around. We call this type of farming sustainable agriculture. Sustainable agriculture is the practice of farming that is not only efficient in creating high quality products, but also incorporates the protection and improvement of the environment, the surrounding community, the businesses, and the well-being of the animals. But how do we know if the foods that we buy are being produced the industrial way or the sustainable way? How do we get involved and show our support for better, healthier food and a cleaner environment? One way is to purchase foods that are organic, non-GMO, or humanely raised. You can find these titles stamped on the packaging of products. Organic foods are foods that are made without the use of GMOs or antibiotics anywhere throughout the production process, as well as allowing humane conditions for the animals to live in throughout their life. With the meat and dairy products, this also includes no GMOs in the food that is fed to the livestock. Purchasing organic foods over the cheaper, more processed alternative is a vote of support for sustainable agriculture. Another way to support sustainable agriculture is to purchase locally produced foods from places like farmers markets. The further food has to travel to get your plate, the worse it is for our environment due to transportation. Do our fossil fuels and our environment a favor and buy local foods. Critics of sustainable agriculture will argue that it is not possible to feed the world's massive population using these traditional techniques. What many of them don't realize or fail to accept is that we already produce enough food to feed the world's population. Our issue is how much food we waste and our inability to distribute food where it needs to go the most. These are topics for someone else's TED Talk, though. Thank you all for your time today, and remember to keep buying organics. Thank you.